I'm absolutely honoured to introduce our first speaker, Jimi Olaghere, who will essentially tell his story about life before, during and after CRISPR. So welcome, Jimi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to tell you a story. About 5 years ago, I got a therapy, and the catalyst of that therapy was CRISPR. Before that, my life was completely different than what you'll see on this journey that we'll take together. So I was diagnosed with sickle cell disease. I was diagnosed at birth. Funny story about my diagnosis is, as you can tell by my name, I'm actually of Nigerian heritage. But I was born in the US, fortunately. The reason I was born in the US is at the time I was conceived in 1985, my mother didn't have access to something as simple as newborn screening. But she was fortunate enough to be able to fly to the US to get that newborn screening done. That screening confirmed that I would have sickle cell disease, and fortunately, my parents gave birth to me in the US. I like to call myself one of the luckiest, if not the luckiest person that has sickle cell disease, and you'll find out as we go through. So just being born in the US is one of the reasons why I'm standing in front of you today. So growing up, we went back to Nigeria. I grew up in Nigeria with sickle cell disease in a low resource setting. Aside from not having access to newborn screening, when we moved back to the US, things that are considered standard of care here, well, not here, in the US, we didn't have access to as well in Nigeria. As most of you know, sickle cell disease is a red blood cell disorder. Basically what's happening is the general population have circular red blood cells, and I have sickled red blood cells, which causes a lot of problems. It causes a lot of traffic jams in your veins because red blood cells are very, very vital, particularly in moving oxygen around the body. But when you have sickled red blood cells, they're not able to move that vital oxygen to the organs that need it. Most people think sickle cell disease is just a disease of pain, which it is. The hallmark of the disease is pain, but all of your organs are in jeopardy because all of your organs need healthy oxygen to function properly. So when I would get crises in Nigeria, I didn't have access to something like a blood transfusion or even high-powered opioid pain medications. I remember my crises in Nigeria being extremely difficult. My parents would spend the entire night massaging my back with a simple menthol rub and something called paracetamol, which is basically an over-the-counter pain medication. And they would go for hours, alternating. My mom will start, and then my dad would take over, and eventually the pain will become so unbearable that I'll end up passing out from that pain. And, I'll wake up in the next morning. I don't know if you guys remember that song from the 2000s, like Sunglasses and Advil. Last night was mad real. That was basically my life growing up with sickle cell disease in Nigeria. In an attempt to improve my quality of life, because I was born in the US, my parents had the idea that, let's move this kid to the US where he'll have access to specialized care in the US, machinery, all the bells and whistles that the West has to offer. They were of the belief that if we moved to the US, my health would improve drastically. So at the age of, 13, we left Nigeria, well, me in particular, and I moved to New Jersey where my aunt was living at the time, with the hopes that being in the US and having access to all the technology, that my life would improve dramatically. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Sickle cell disease is relentless. even if you have access to technology, the disease is going to continue to just beat at you, particularly for someone my age, teenage, young man growing up. There were all these other stressors in life that kept on creating situations where I would find myself in a crisis. So thankfully, we had moved to the US, and I had lots of healthcare intervention that probably saved my life that if I didn't have in the US, I'd have probably lost my life quite early. Like I was saying, the disease affects all of your organs. So one of the first things that happened to me when I had moved to the US is my gallbladder had to be removed. From sickle cell disease, you tend to start producing gallstones quicker than normal. So I'm not sure exactly what age, but I think it was in 2004. That was the first surgery I had to have, was my gallbladder being taken out. And then after that, it was my spleen. Fortunately, I kept my spleen, but I was 7 hours away from losing my spleen. So what happens is, with sickle cell disease, your spleen tends to enlarge. And when it engorges like that, if it doesn't go down, the standard of care is usually to take it out. And the hematologist had warned me, like, I'm in the emergency room at this point. Listen, if we don't get you to a room to administer some pain medication and some other therapies to help, if when I come back in the morning and your spleen is still this size, we're going to have to take it out. In that situation, like I said, thankfully my spleen went back to its normal size, so today I still have that. Another thing that tends to happen with sickle cell disease is called avascular necrosis. This is when those healthy red blood cells are missing from your joints, so they tend to grind upon each other. So I have avascular necrosis of both hips. Many times I've been advised to get a hip replacement. Thankfully, I did not get a hip replacement. Even though my hips are not great, they are still functioning good. I've gone blind for 24 hours, which was also sickle cell related. I had no idea that was possible, but if you don't have good red blood cells flowing to the nerves at the back of your eyes, it can cause you to go blind. I've suffered a cardiac arrest at the age of 26. One of the things that happen when you have sickle cell disease is that you often need blood transfusions quickly, a lot. And the way they get it is through a vein in your arm. But because you're being punctured so often, so regularly, your veins begin to deplete. So at one point, I needed to get something called a portacath. And a portacath is just a simple device. I'm sure most of you know what it is, where you can just easily, it's connected to your main vein, where you can administer blood and pain medication because they can't get it through the vein. So getting this portacath put in, what's standard of care for someone with sickle cell disease is when you're having any type of surgery at all, no matter how small, you need to do a blood transfusion. In this case, the hematologist did not want to do a blood transfusion. Well, I'm sorry, not the hematologist. The surgeon didn't want to do a blood transfusion. If it was a hematologist, he would have known that we needed a blood transfusion before we did the surgery, no matter how small it was. But he got in an argument with my wife, and this is one thing that you'll find with sickle cell disease is because it's so stigmatized, you find that you need to advocate, or you need a lot of advocates if you can advocate for yourself. The surgeon did not want to give me a blood transfusion because he thought it was a very, very simple surgery, and just putting in a portacath is not going to cause any adverse effect, which is true if I didn't have sickle cell disease. But because I did, after that surgery, which I did not receive a blood transfusion from, I suffered a cardiac arrest, which was devastating. I think that was probably my worst sickle cell crisis, and it actually started off a chain of events that really got me to where I'm at today. So that cardiac arrest was so devastating, and I remember being in the ICU for about 3 weeks, just lost, depressed, suicidal, if I'm quite honest. And my wife and I are living in New Jersey at this point, and we made the decision to move down south just to improve my health. Down south, Atlanta, the Atlanta metro area, for guys that are not familiar, usually the weather down there, it's warmer. So we had this idea that being in a warmer climate can be more conducive to a disease like sickle cell disease. So we moved down south, and things got a bit better, but I was still suffering from sickle cell disease. And like I said, the disease is relentless. No matter where you are, warm weather in the US, it's still a genetic disease, and that same mutation of not creating regular red blood cells is still going to affect you. So even though we had moved, I was still really suffering from the disease, and particularly because I had come close to losing my life. On many occasions, but in this particular one, it was so close that it really scarred my parents and my family, and they really started to push me to find a solution to this disease to improve my quality of life. So the first thing we did is, excuse me, I have 3 sisters. We tried for a bone marrow transplant. They all came over from different parts of the world. They came to where I was at. Unfortunately for me, out of 3 sisters, none of them, not a single one. And does anyone here have sisters that always disappoints them? This was my case. None of my sisters were a match. At the time, we were disappointed, but in hindsight, it turned out to be a good thing. Then the next step after this research, I had actually quite given up. I had become quite jaded with living. Life was terrible. I was in pain. I had a blood transfusion that put me in a coma for 24 hours. It was just constant. It was nonstop. But as parents do, they will continue to push you. So I had done this research. I had started hearing rumors of something called gene therapy. And gene therapy, sickle cell disease is genetic. Maybe one day, gene therapy can solve sickle cell disease. So I had done research, and I found out that, yeah, maybe sickle cell disease can be cured by gene therapy. Let me do this research, present it to my parents, and really have them get off my back. That was the goal. I was actually not interested in it. I was just like, just leave me alone. So I'd done the research. I'd put a Google alert in my inbox for anything related to gene therapy and sickle cell disease. If anything ever propagates on the internet, I'll get an alert. I thought this was probably some science fiction stuff. I like to call gene therapy Star Wars medicine. So I wasn't expecting anything for decades or at all. And to my surprise, about 6, 7, maybe even a year after that research, I got an article in my inbox from somebody called Victoria Gray, who was the first person to go through a CRISPR-based gene editing therapy to alleviate the symptoms of her sickle cell disease. This was in 2019. And quite serendipitous because 2019 was also the time my mindset has switched from not wanting to be alive to desperately wanting to be alive because of one thing. My wife was pregnant. After 7 years of trying for children, we had finally been able to conceive through IVF. So the fact that this article magically came into my inbox at the same time that my wife was pregnant, just continues that thread of how fortunate I am. So when we got that article, and it was Victoria, who, by the way, is the courageous one. A lot of people call me courageous. I think I was just desperate. Victoria was more courageous than anything because she was the first one, without any idea of what is to come on the other side, that took a step into the dark. And many of us are now benefiting from that today. So we reached out to the clinician or the principal investigator that had started that clinical trial. The next day he called back, which was completely unreal, because anytime we had found or attempted some type of curative therapy, there was always a roadblock, being maybe not finding a match in my sisters or the therapy just not being available to me. But this one was available. The investigator was excited. They wanted me to fly down. They flew my wife and I down to Nashville. And like I said, because I didn't get a bone marrow match in my sisters, this actually was one of the eligibility criteria for this clinical trial I was going to partake in. So that completely helped me. And to my shock, after going through a series of tests to find out if you are healthy enough, but at the same time sick enough to go through a clinical trial, I qualified. So they sent a bunch of consent papers down for me to sign, and I didn't even want to read it. I just wanted to sign on the dotted line, and my wife is going through it. Do you see what this says? There's a potential for cancer in here. There's something called off-target editing. Do you know what any of these are? But I was in such a desperate place to not pass the burden of caregiving down to my children or not leave my wife alone with children that I didn't even care. Even if I had 5 good years of this therapy, that was worth it, from the 30 years I had had before. So of course after she had knuckled down and forced me to read that consent form, we signed away, and in January of 2020, we started the journey of getting infused of what is now known today as Casgevy. So when we started in January, everything was smooth sailing. Usually, in my case, there are 4 main steps for getting your genes edited. The first step is something they call keeping you on ice. Basically, it's just blood transfusions, blood exchanges, just keeping you healthy for what's to come. The second stage is the collection phase, and this is where I faced a bit of trouble. So in 2020, as most of you remember, we had a global pandemic, and as we started the collection phase, everything shut down. I started off as patient number 16. But because my wife and I had moved down south to the Atlanta metro area, and the clinical trial was taking place in a city called Nashville, which is also in the south, patients that lived in coastal cities like LA, New York, that they couldn't participate anymore, they had to stop completely. But the principal investigator had told me that, listen, once they give you the green light to start driving again, I'm going to write you a note. If you leave down south, why don't you just continue this clinical trial, which we agreed to. So I started off as patient number 16 in this clinical trial, but ended up finishing as patient number 4, which is that thread of good luck, good fortune again. So the collection phase, aside from just having to stop, I had to get collected 4 times. We have no idea why, which is a huge problem. It speaks to the lack of genetic diversity in clinical trials, which is something that we need to fix. When I did get collected, which is an uncomfortable process, you get infused in the morning, or you get an injection of something called prolaxafor, which I'm sure all of you know what that is here. And what that does is it stimulates your stem cells into your blood vessels, and then you sit next to an apheresis machine for about 8 hours, and it just sucks all the stem cells, and it returns the blood, but in the process, you also lose some blood, so you most likely need a blood transfusion after. Which was the case for me many times, for the 4 times, I should say. And then there's the chemotherapy part, which is also quite uncomfortable. They tell you you're going to have mouth sores, but you don't know how debilitating these mouth sores are until you actually have it. There's no explaining. They gave us a heads up, yeah, you're going to get mouth sores, it's going to be painful. And still, I was completely in shock when I got those mouth sores, and just to see how extremely painful they were. Nausea, you're not able to eat, very, very uncomfortable, but it's par for the course for at least an ex vivo gene therapy. And then the final stage is the infusion. So after all the work of collecting the stem cells, I was right there at the apheresis unit when I saw my stem cells being collected, a carrier rushing with a freezer bag of these big bags of blood. They're shipping away to a manufacturing center in Farmington, Massachusetts. It comes back with 3 clear vials, syringes. It was kind of anticlimactic to me because we had done all this work, and you see these big bags of blood being shipped out in such an urgent manner. And when it's time to get infused from all those stem cells they collect, it was just 3 random syringes. So that was a bit of surprise to me. But yeah, you get those syringes back, and I got infused right there. Nothing specific, nothing to write home about. It was during the pandemic, so my parents weren't there. They were in the corner on a Zoom call, and all I remember is just that the room smelled like canned corn. I don't know why. Apparently, it has something to do with how they preserve the stem cells. And you get infused in about 15 minutes. Your heart races a little bit, and that's about it. And after I got my infusion, I believe it was probably 2-3 weeks after, I, with my sickle cell disease, have this lingering pain all the time. Even when I'm on pain medication, this pain is just part of what I had to deal with. I noticed that lingering pain had completely disappeared. And, instead of being elated, excited, I was actually kind of lost because for so long, I had used pain as a way to motivate myself, as a way to get things done. And all of a sudden, this pain had completely disappeared. So I was in shock, and I was actually quite upset at myself that, there are people out there still living with sickle cell disease in the traditional format and are still in real pain. And here am I, after being quote unquote cured, and I'm not happy. So that's one of the things that most people are coming to realize post-transplant is that people with chronic illnesses that they've lived with for their entire life, their personality kind of gets meshed with that disease. And when it finally disengages, there needs to be some post-transplant support to help, start life after a disease. So I got that infusion, and I got the mental health side of things sorted. And one of the things I realized, the most surprising thing to me about getting Casgevy was not the fact that I was in less pain, or actually no pain at all, no emergency rooms. The most surprising thing was just the amount of energy I had. I was every day waking up as if I had chugged Red Bull before bed. Just so much energy, I couldn't control it. And finally being in control of my own health, my own body, I became like a health nut, working out, just finally having control of how my body feels was just a shock, special to me. I would go to bed with minor aches after a long day and not take any pain medication, wake up, and my body had completely healed itself, which sounds so mundane, but to me, I felt like Wolverine. That I could just go to bed and my body would heal itself. It was just quite special. So I started this journey of, wanting to be in good physical health for the first time in my 35, 36 years on Earth. And all of a sudden, I think it was probably 2-3 years after my transplant and me working out and being healthy, which I had no idea there was something coming down the road for this. I get an email from a gentleman called Luke Timmerman to come and participate in something called the Timmerman Traverse, which is a hike that has a good cause attached to it. The good cause in this case was raising money for sickle cell disease. So, feeling in fantastic physical condition, I accepted the challenge, and I think it was in September of 2024, I set off with a group of biotech execs to scale Kilimanjaro. We did a bunch of training throughout the year because, as most of you know, the clinical trial I went through did not target the sickle cell mutation. It targeted BCL11A. It turned it off. So I produce hemoglobin F, which means I'm also producing sickle cell as well. So there was a lot of fear in the community that because I'm still producing sickle cell disease, I'm still producing sickle cells. People that have sickle cells are not supposed to go over, I think it's about 7,000 feet. That's why when you watch American football, the NFL, players that have the sickle cell trait are not even allowed to travel alone, let alone suit up, because with physical exertion, high altitudes, there's still a huge chance of spurring on a crisis. So in order to avoid this, I trained the whole summer, did some hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then eventually went to Colorado to do high altitude training. And thanks to that training and the fantastic porters in Tanzania, I was able to summit Kilimanjaro and be the first person with sickle cell disease to make the summit of Kilimanjaro, which was fantastic. But my biggest lesson while in Tanzania was the founder of this expedition. We did a small educational session in regards to sickle cell disease, given that we were in Africa. I like to call the epicenter of sickle cell disease. We wanted to let the people know what we were doing there. And we did an educational session, and we come to realize that in these remote parts of Africa, they don't even know what sickle cell disease is. And aside from that, they don't even have access to the basics. That's when I realized that there's also another figurative mountain to climb in making sure that the population that is desperately in need of these therapies have access to it. So today, what is the landscape of gene therapy? I went from a man with a death wish, a wife, and a dog, who died, by the way. Rest in peace, Snickers. To today, I'm a father with 3 beautiful children, first person with sickle cell disease to summit Mount Kilimanjaro, thanks to an infusion of my own cells that was genetically modified in a lab. And there are millions of people suffering from this disease. But because I was so fortunate, like I said, probably one of the most fortunate persons to have this disease, I'm here today. It's been very crazy 5 years. I'm often filled with a variety of emotions. I wake up every day extremely excited with the life that I have and wanting to go and take on the day. And then 20 minutes after, I'm like guilt-ridden, the fact that other people don't have access to the same things that I've had access to. So I've been doing a lot of work to try and bridge that gap. And thankfully, a lot of you have been as well. So there have been some advancements in cell and gene therapy that I'm sure everybody is well aware of and probably know way better than me. One of the things that we're looking forward to potentially help these therapies get to the populations that really need them is, moving from an ex vivo model to an in vivo model of gene therapy, where the cells are, where the therapy is infused directly into the body, and all of that conditioning and collection is completely eliminated. And this would make it accessible to the people that truly need it. Quick. I know the Bill Gates Foundation is doing something with Tessera Therapeutics, and they're working to get in vivo therapies to low resource settings, as well as high resource settings, but with the goal of getting in to low resource settings at scale at a cost model. But there's still a lot of issues with this therapy, particularly in the current form that it is. Even in high resource settings, or in the West, like in the US, we have something called a value-based healthcare system. What that means is that the price of the therapy is attached to the value it brings to the patient. And with gene therapy for sickle cell disease, we've seen the evidence that the value is there. So no matter how much the manufacturers cut the cost of that therapy, it's still going to be $2.3 million. So that's one of the things that we need to work on, particularly in the US, is the healthcare system. We need to find a way to bring new, novel ways to pay for novel technologies. Infrastructure. Like I said, when I was getting my stem cells collected, literally there was a FedEx carrier standing at the door. As soon as I was done, he would run, grab it, put it in a cold box, ship it in a plane to where it would get manufactured. So that's another thing that we need to start thinking about, is how to reduce the cost of manufacturing and reduce our reliance on cold chain logistics. Another big thing, like I talked about, was the misinformation and the lack of awareness, not just about sickle cell disease, but about gene therapies in general. There's still not enough accurate information in regards to what gene therapy is for sickle cell disease. As a matter of fact, I even think there's misinformation out there. There are a few patient educational materials that are out there that live on the pages of the NIH and other websites, but patient educational materials, by definition, need to be disseminated, not just uploaded and left there. That's the issue we're having right now, is that patient educational materials are not being disseminated. And dissemination is a consistent effort of spreading awareness on something. And that is not being done right now. So that's another barrier to access. And of course, we have the regulatory hurdles, which is understandable because we are genetically modifying human cells. But there needs to be a way to get these medicines approved faster. I know right now in the current climate, it's going to be difficult. But honestly, I want to take a look at, see if it's possible, if you can take a playbook from other manufacturers in other countries and see how quickly drugs are being approved, and apply that same process to the US or other countries in the West. I want to briefly touch on the real-world impacts of inaccessibility. So this is a young boy I had come to know really well from coming public with my story. I think it was in 2021, 2022, after my transplant, after hearing Victoria's story and having a poor experience with my hematologist. He did not want me to actually move forward with the gene therapy. He was telling me that gene therapy had closed, this clinical trial is done, I don't think it's for you, which was a complete surprise to me because as a hematologist or my physician, you are supposed to do everything you can to improve my health, and I felt he wasn't doing that. So after I'd gone through that experience, after reading Victoria's story, I'm like, I have a feeling there's going to be patients in this same scenario as well. So let me reach out and tell my story as well. So I reached out to the Vertex Comms team, and I let them know, hey, listen, I am interested in coming forward and coming public with my story, so other potential patients out there can see how powerful and potentially curative this gene therapy is. So they responded, and some articles were out there, and my story went into the public domain. And it was wild how many patients reached out to me from all over the world, patients in the US, but mostly patients in sub-Saharan Africa. There was a man, and he reached out to me almost every month asking when gene therapy is going to come to the shores of Africa. He actually even asked me to connect him to Dr. Haydar Frangoul, who was the principal investigator in my clinical trial. I'm like, listen, if you just connect me with Frangoul, I will talk my way into a clinical trial. That's how desperate this man was. And I tried to tell him, that's not how clinical trials work, sir. I can't do that. And he kept on saying, you don't understand how bad. My son is sick every single day. He's in a crisis. Just please, anything you can do. And, we talked about getting him hydroxyurea, and to my shock, he had never even heard of hydroxyurea. Mind you, this man is also from Nigeria, the place I'm from as well. We're both from Nigeria, but two different stories. Today, I'm here standing in front of you, and this poor boy died at the age of 4 last year in November from complications from sickle cell disease. This is real face of what inaccessibility can cause. Two boys from the same country. One of them is standing here in front of you, and one of them is no longer here, who would have probably done better with all of the opportunities that I've had access to, and he does not even have a chance to become a young boy. That's why accessibility is such a big topic and huge issue for me. So, I want to echo some of the things I had talked about so far in making sure that these therapies become accessible from what I've learned from my Kilimanjaro trip. It was a fantastic endeavor from a bunch of biotech companies and the government. So I really want to continue to spread that word of, we hear it all the time, public-private partnerships. You know, it's a buzzword, not just in gene therapy, in any industry. But here, this is where it means more because it's literally going to save people's lives. I know we are in an unfortunate situation where, at least in the US, we don't have the public side as invested as the private side, which means that our work has to make up for the void that they're going to leave. And, you know, like I said, just continuing to spread that message. I'm doing another campaign again in September to raise new funds for the basics, newborn screening, which has been a full circle moment for me because I didn't have access to that newborn screening. So the fact that I get to go and climb mountains to raise money for newborn screening has been so full circle. Even though it's quite unsustainable, I don't think I'm going to be able to climb a mountain every year, you know, to raise money for newborn screening and hydroxyurea. So that's why I want to continue to encourage sustainable ways to make sure accessibility is guaranteed to the people that need these therapies the most. And we've been seeing some fantastic solutions in actions that are coming to place already. This newborn screening initiative that I've been a participant of, it's going to save lives. Many ways that people or children in low to middle income countries perish from sickle cell disease is because they don't know they have sickle cell disease. That's why newborn screening is so important. Typically what happens is they get a stroke at the age of 5 and they run to the nearest center of excellence, and that's when they are diagnosed with sickle cell. But by that time, it's too late. The stroke has already damaged them irreparably, and most of them, because they haven't been diagnosed at an early age, tend to perish from the disease. Also with hydroxyurea as well, you know, just getting them on these treatments pretty quickly. There's a lot of initiatives, thanks to the African Organization and the World Health Organization, making sure that these therapies, particularly hydroxyurea, are available en masse, in liquid form, in pill form, anything we can do to make sure that while we're keeping the patients that need these therapies alive until gene therapies eventually proliferate. And then, like I mentioned, patient educational materials. Here in the U.S., I keep on saying here in the U.S. like I'm back home. In the U.S., a lot of patients still don't know gene therapies exist. And it's a huge problem. I'm finding out that there are hematologists that are actually not being transparent to patients, not putting all of the solutions on the table. They are either invested in bone marrow transplant alone for some certain reason, I have no clue why, and they are completely eliminating the other curative therapies that could potentially save patients' lives. That's a huge problem. So aside from creating educational materials for patients, we also need to create educational materials for providers. You know, there are a lot of providers that are not transplant specialists that even don't know how gene therapy works. So that needs to be an effort that goes hand in hand with patient educational materials. We need to also provide provider educational materials. And then we're seeing fantastic collaborations from companies like Syndago and AstraZeneca, you know, where they are sub-licensing their nucleuses to make it affordable and democratizing CRISPR tools to anyone who wants to use it for commercial use or therapeutic use. This is a big win, you know, because I'm sure most of you know this, it's so expensive to get a CRISPR therapy commercialized. Look what happened to Editas Medicine in the last few months. You know, they started a clinical trial, showed a handful of patients a fantastic promise of what life could potentially look like when they get this clinical trial, when they finish this clinical trial, and they pulled the rug from under them when they had no path to commercialization, which is a reality for them as well. It's a company, so they need to make money at the end of the day. But the licenses are so expensive that they have to put that into the mathematics of if they could potentially get something on the other side commercially. If we have access to licenses that are not as expensive as what we have on the market today, we can see more genetic therapies on the other side that could potentially save patients' lives. Now, there are almost 100 of patients that have been lost and almost been re-diagnosed again with sickle cell disease because they started off on this clinical trial that could potentially save their life, and all of a sudden it's gone. So just to round off, just the call to action, because this is the exact room. We have a room full of industry professionals. One of the biggest mistakes we keep making is we make these gene therapies and we think of accessibility as an afterthought instead of as the first thing we should think of when we make it. That's an example of where eSpot On would be perfect. We're buying or we're licensing a nucleus that is typically cheaper to start with, so this will make it affordable on the other side. So I want you guys to start thinking of that. When you're creating these therapies, accessibility should be the first thing in mind. Yes, making money is a good thing and you need to be rewarded for your innovation, but I think there's a way to do both hand in hand. Take Tessera Therapeutics, for example. Hopefully, what they've told me is that when these in vivo therapies that they are producing with the help of the Gates Foundation become ready to go to low interest or low resource settings, they're planning to use something called a cost plus model, where they get the cost of the medication or the therapy back plus a little additional. And for the policymakers, I know it's hard, particularly in the US, but we need to find a way to make sure that we are approving these therapies quicker. I know, yes, there needs to be a lot of scrutiny, particularly when we're editing stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells in vivo, but the science is good enough. When the data is good enough, there should be no hurdles to get the therapy to patients as quickly as possible, because patients are literally dying. And then the community, particularly for any specific chronic illness, the awareness part, the patient educational materials, we need to continue to do the work. Community members, particularly patients, they need advocates. So we need to continue to advocate for these patients that are not able to advocate for themselves, particularly for a disease like sickle cell disease or even AIDS. We need to take a huge lesson from the AIDS advocates from the 90s and how they were able to create serious change for their community when they were reeling from the disease back in the 90s before PEPFAR was eventually introduced to help solve that problem. That's the type of community advocate and engagement we need to see again. And with that, thank you.
Jimi, it was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I hope you have questions. At least we have time for a few questions. I was curious to ask, if I may, how long did the process take from when you initially signed the dotted line in desperation to when you got the infusion, and how did you cope and your family cope with the uncertainty that there was during that time?
It took about a year. Initially, when we started, they had told us it would probably take 9 months, but because of the pandemic, it added 3 extra months. And I thought that was long, but it is an ex vivo therapy with actual transplant, so I think it was par for the course for it to be that long. How did we cope with the uncertainty? Honestly, I don't even think we could. We just had it. To be fair, I had seen Victoria's story, and I had seen, just based off of the data and just looking at her, that there wasn't any need to be too worried, even though this was still very novel, and still very novel. But I had spoken to Victoria, which was patient number 1. I also spoke to patient number 2 and patient number 3, and all of them were faring well. So just based off seeing that, that's why it's so important to hear other people's story. Just based off seeing those first 3 and seeing the fact that they hadn't experienced any adverse effects, I was pretty certain, at least in the short term, there wouldn't be any adverse effects. I was certain that I'll be okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
What's the next mountain you're going to climb? Anything you're going to do where we all can maybe donate a bit more or
Yes.
join you, really?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Yes, I am in the works of doing another climb. I wish I put it on my slide, but I wasn't quick enough. But yeah, a mountain we're going to climb in Colorado, and I'll share the details with you, where it's the same goal. And this time we were able to rope Victoria Gray in to come participate with us. Last week we actually trained together, and she, like the true warrior she is, this woman went from being bedridden similar to me, and she's climbing mountains just to make sure that people understand that these gene therapies do work, and there's a huge problem with accessibility of them. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Joseph from Nigeria, and I can really relate directly when you were speaking. Very happy. My question is, are you taking any practical step to ensure that you help us in creating the awareness in Nigeria? I research in genome medicine, but we still need, like, one of the points you raised in terms of awareness and education is still very low in Africa. And probably if Africa is the epicenter of sickle cell, I think a lot of awareness is needed so that probably our leaders can actually support some of us that are working in that space. So I don't know whether you have any move or thinking towards, especially Nigeria. You cited 2 examples, Nigeria, and I'm from Nigeria. But is there anything you're doing about it? Thank you.
Agreed. Most people don't know that Nigeria actually has the largest population of sickle cell disease in the world. Anywhere. It's a huge issue there. And there needs to be a lot of work that continues to go in there. Unfortunately, it's really slow. There's a lot of work we are doing with the GGTI, the Global Gene Therapy Initiative, run by someone called Jennifer Adair. And we are starting the process to do gene therapy in low resource settings without the use of a GMP, which is possible. The GGTI has already brought the first CAR T therapy to India in a bone marrow transplant center, and it worked, making use of things like point of care manufacturing, where you don't need to ship cells across the country. The cells are collected and manufactured right there on site. We think with using strategies like that, with the help of the African Union and the World Health Organization, that very soon there should be gene therapies coming to Africa, but it's still going to be, unfortunately, a long road. So that's why it's important to keep the patients there alive or improve their quality of life with the basics like newborn screening and hydroxyurea. And I can guarantee that's going to go on for the next 5 to 10 years before these therapies are eventually available.
Any more questions? No. Okay, so with that, we say thank you once more to Jimmy. That was lovely.